session for the conference. So this is our roundtable on prosody and sociolinguistics. So we have up here, oh, did you see the right? No, you didn't see the right order this time. Zach Cooper and Jim Stanford, and we have Balzam and Ralph Desma. There's Levin or Levon? I'm so sorry. Levon. Initial stress. Yep. Thank you. And Pilar, I saw somewhere Pilar Prieto coming. I thought I just spelled it, but okay, that's fine. We can get started. Or maybe I should wait just a second. Oh, she's locked out. Very, very welcoming. And Pilar Prieto. Please join us. Oh. So I've been really delighted to hear all of social linguistics in this conference. So there are a few things I thought of. This is of course open to everyone, as always. We also welcome any contributions people want to make here. See, if you want your contributions here, woohoo! And that's on the back of your name tag. We'll write the link for that. So here are the things I at least thought of wanted to touch on. One is on asking and reporting on different kinds of speaker characteristics, and then building on that, simultaneously considering these factors and other linguistic factors in research. And then something that came up in part because of the focus of this past morning, which is defining, estimating, measuring, and analyzing F0 and other voice characteristics. So we had a variety of things that came with this. I was very appreciative. Lal had this section where he told us about how we can even ask about gender, sex, if people are trans, related, and related speaker characteristics. Something that we were just talking about that came up is, well, we can do this. But one issue that may come up is we have really small numbers for any particular group, and I think there are some thoughts floating around that you can voice.
So now. Yeah, okay. So, so Lal and I were obviously sort of expressing to Lal the experiences that I've had trying to use more inclusive categories for things like gender and sexuality, and just sort of either whether that's just open questions or including more options for people to select into. But then a problem that somebody, I can't remember who it was, voiced about having them very small ends in some of those categories. And most people say, well, select man, woman, and then you've got, 5 people that are not doing that. And then what do you do with that in a statistical analysis? Do you then just exclude those? Do you lump them in somewhere else? And I feel like it sort of puts you in this weird bind, because it almost feels to me sort of more disrespectful to be asking people in a more inclusive way and then just be excluding them for that. So it's like I'm erasing the experience that I'm trying to foster in how I ask the question. So I'm not quite sure what to do with that.
I mean, I think like part of the question, especially if what we're talking about is non-binary people being in, or just people in the other category being a small number, is that I think the lived experience of not having one's gender perceived in the way that one identifies is such that actually even just being asked that at all is such a positive thing, that even being excluded from a study, I think that is a preferable outcome than not asking and either assuming or forcing people into a binary choice. But when Eris and I were talking about this, I was also, there's also like the cumulative effect of exclusion, right? And so if every study asks about people's gender identity and then every study excludes people whose gender identity isn't easy to model, that has a major cumulative effect. And actually one thing that I didn't mention in my talk and kind of meant to is that I see part of this as also being about diversifying the field of linguistics. I don't know how many of you have maybe taught a phonetics class that had trans students, but it can be a very upsetting experience to have this kind of very naturalizing discourse that your sex determines what kind of voice you have. And I think it actually puts a lot of trans people off from linguistics, when really, like, linguistics should have tons of trans people. I mean, this is a group of people who talk about language constantly, have incredible insights, produce really complex analyses, and yet, there are very, very few openly trans linguists.
Any other thoughts about that right now?
I guess I was thinking of, because yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and we need to add these things in and be sensitive, but at the same time, we're also talking about all of this in a Western context, and so there's that component too to think of. I think as we go, we need to just think of it on a community by community basis, probably rather than being able to say, well, here's a template we're going to use, we're going to figure it out today. That would work everywhere, because I'm picturing some villages I go to in China somewhere where they wouldn't have a framework to understand what we're talking about, even though they probably have these experiences. I would need to approach it in a very different way, even though the needs and concerns are probably equal, but the words I would use would not translate. So,
I mean, even in a Western context, right? So for the Voices of California project, we ask people for sexual orientation, and we just say, we have a form that says sexual orientation in blank line, and I've had many interviewees ask me, I don't know what this means. I've had, people have said their gender for sexual orientation.
And I think the concept of self-identification itself is a very particular kind of cultural construct that's rooted in this kind of neoliberal model of like the individual determines their destiny, and we, that's the most important thing, rather than say what the community's larger framework for understanding gender is.
I saw, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good idea or not. I'd love to get the response of the panel. I like the idea that we don't throw away a small group of people just because we don't have a lot of statistical power to talk about the results from a small group of people. If there were often in papers a little section discussing some results that we can't use statistics for but might provide some insights, is that even worse? I mean, does it make for discomfort?
I don't think so.
Say again?
Depends on the reviewers. Which is us.
And the reviewers.
Oh, the reviewers.
Why are you including? Right,
What
so,
about the people themselves? How uncomfortable might they be? The small group of people in any one study who don't fit into the groups that you have enough people for.
I think it depends on what you say too, right? Because if what you're saying is, oh, this group is so out there, they're not doing the same thing at all, they're, really, I mean, it's easy to suddenly get like very loaded kinds of descriptions, right? So I think the point that I was talking about of having collaborators who are from the community is really useful there to kind of give you a sense of, or even, the actual participants in your study, if you can bring it back to them and say, here, this is what I wrote about you, what do you think? And that doesn't mean that they get, total authority, but it means that you can then integrate that knowledge into your analysis.
The point about the reviewers is a good one also.
Yeah.
right, because we are the community of scholars who say, this man is small. Why bother including in your paper? Throw it out. And then, because we want the thing published, we end up throwing it out. So it really comes back to us again. So.
But I would also argue, and maybe this is what you were saying, that if you actually do have a small n, you are much more liable to have individual idiosyncrasies in your data. So you may be claiming things about a large population of, from a small amount of individuals. So I think you also have to temper it both ways, that it may mean nothing generally. So.
I think there are big limits. I mean, the way that we treat gender in particular, when it comes to generalizability, I mean, it's kind of stunning how small the numbers often are. It'll be, 10 women, 10 men, and then women do this and men do that.
Right.
I mean, talk to a statistician about that, and they'll throw you out of their office,
And I also think Lal had a really good point in the talk just earlier of pointing out that in thinking about sex, voices with the phonetics, it really is the outliers where a lot of the action is and the construction of those things, and so it's tragic to throw those out. Statistically or not, some of those voices are telling us what we really need to know. Maybe they need to be handled differently, but they should never be taken out of the study completely.
I actually think the same point applies to even studies that have a much higher end. So I was thinking about this during last talk. You had, I don't know how many people, you had lots and lots of people, and there were these lines going up on your graph, right, that showed how much CREAK you're getting at the beginning versus the
I don't think it's I think it's that the effect is smaller than the effect of, in this particular example, the effect of gender is smaller than the effect of phrase position. But I don't think it's driven by a couple of outliers. It's just a small effect.
You just say it's consistent, but more women are just doing this more regularly.
Well, and in terms of the statistics, you have more observations for each of the linguistic contexts and fewer for the people, right? So we would expect regression to find that if there was a linguistic effect, it has more data to find it.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say in that particular case just because the phrase position is a continuous factor, and the way I've operationalized gender, it's not.
There's also something that you generally find, at least in a lot of sociolinguistic work, the linguistic factors tend to be the strongest predictors, and then the social factors sort of sit on top of that. So one generally finds.
Yeah, so one thing I'll just quickly mention, so, this is something that came up in general that I really appreciated hearing about different ways to ask about properties of speakers. And I was going to, take an inventory of some of these, and I realized I couldn't remember what any of them were. But then, one thing I was wondering is if there maybe in social linguistics there already is some kind of set of shared resources where people say like, oh, this is how you ask about this and that and something. But I'm wondering if you could somehow work on that. So I don't know if there is such a thing already. No? What? I'm sad. But how can we make that better? Or should we? I would like to know what tools are available.
But I do think it speaks back to Jim's point earlier too, that so much of this is community specific. So I find that sociolinguists, we often devise our own questions that we want asked or that we decide to ask based on the sort of contours of this particular community that we're working in. I'm not sure if we could devise this sort of one size fits all or fits many.
But I think maybe what I was thinking of is, so leading into the second part about incorporating, different kinds of factors, well, the precursor of doing that is being aware of such things. Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe a starting point would be what even, kinds of properties have people been thinking about and have been finding. I don't know, somehow, so if people have thoughts on, the ETAP4 or something, and also when people put up their slides on the OSF repository, so in the OSF repository, we already have quite a few things, but, I'll just, whatever, so, I don't know, just click on one of them, and you have places where you can, I'm not actually sure for conferencing, but at least when I've done repositories, you can add other things as well. So, you certainly could add other things. But anyway, I'd love to see something like that to at least raise awareness of things to think about that I usually wouldn't have even thought about. I mean, obviously, like we've been saying, it depends on the community, which is also related to it depends on your research questions. But I think something that people have very, really got into my conscious is that even if you're interested in a particular thing, of course, by not thinking about something else, you may have gotten quite different answers because you didn't consider this other thing. It's a general thing that I think we kind of learned.
I mean, I think one thing, I'm sorry to be monopolizing, but something that I was talking to Jim about earlier too is that psychology has developed just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these sort of standardized instruments that are problematic in certain ways, but that also can be very useful. So like all the ones that, the sort of ambivalent sexism inventory and the rateness acceptance scale and, even the autism quotient, these are all sort of mostly developed by psychologists to measure various things. And I think that sociolinguistics is sort of coming around to paying more attention to these kinds of things. And so there is, there are encyclopedias full of these different inventories that could be useful. So that's a kind of speaker characteristic that can be looked at.
Yeah, so maybe one thing is, you could have, oh, here's an example of something, but bearing in mind, of course, it depends on your community. But
yeah, general topics are very useful. I mean, for me, I would flip through various handbooks of sociolinguistics to say, are there factors or issues that I'm not thinking of? That might be a way I would try to make sure I'm not forgetting something, but no handbook's ever complete.
yeah, I guess, and maybe one really, the most, efficient way is to, like Lala's been saying, talk to people. And so how have I learned about these things and other people? Well, because we came together. So I guess one of the things, of course, is to be talking to each other. when you can phone in. So I don't know. So maybe I'll lead then into the the natural thing, which is I saying, well, you have to be aware of these things, but then how the heck do we really simultaneously consider social and linguistic and all these different variables in research? We've heard about different things. So we had things where people were saying like, oh, yeah, we wish that you had looked into focus conditions and things, and then other things like where we should have thought about considering stance. So there's stance, and so we would love to think about these different things. A related issue that came up in the AAE roundtable was a sort of continuum ecological ability that Megan and her little one Tristan told us about. This Alhausen, and I don't know, do you want to say something very briefly about this? It's kind of a related issue in part.
Yeah, I guess.
Or well, also you can too.
Well, I think as someone who wanted to be a sociolinguist and then didn't end up being one, I got to kind of see both sides, right? Where we want to have real speech and we want to have spontaneous speech, but I think very often it's difficult to remember that we kind of have to start with something like lab speech, right? For intonational categories, we need to figure out what the categories are before we can start looking at them and counting them and treating them as variables. So I think we have to kind of care about both sides of the scale right here between what Feldhausen and colleagues refer to as correlational research versus experimental research. And so kind of taking that extra step and figuring things out and then saying, all right, now we can go into the spontaneous speech and look for these things that we know exist.
Yeah, so I don't have much to say here. I just love to hear what people have to say. So please have something to say though.
Well, I mean, this is something sociolinguists have been doing since Lebov's days. Lebov's dissertation is gathering lots of different types of data. Like I said, Canning and Schoen were talking about this and with Jamaican Creole, right? So get some right speech, get some experimental methods, but also get some spontaneous speech, get some dyads, so that way you can sort of have two-way confirmation of, you have the experimental sort of part where it's easier to figure out what the categories are, and then you can sort of reinforce that data with what you're seeing in the spontaneous speech and saying, yes, this does actually come in the real world, and vice versa. So stuff that you observe in the corpora, you can go back and test. And again, this is something I think that comes naturally to sociolinguists because we've all read Lebov's dissertation where you're getting red speech, wordless, you're getting the interviews, you're getting running up to people in Macy's. So.
But then at the same time, people dive into intonation without getting that kind of data, and it's really messy, and you can't really make any generalizations.
And as we think more and more about the social meaning and the situated context, there's speech tell. I'm just thinking of the Native American study where Zach's group had this innovation of we set up this study to do interviews with people. We asked about Native ethnic identity, all these things, and none of these prosodic patterns we're looking for showed up. Could you tell how you were able to, like the food parties and stuff, if you guys started talking?
No, I guess it just depends, like, what Law was talking, like, it's very communal specific, and, like, as much as, like, everyone here wants to go into these communities, you're still going to be viewed as a researcher, no matter what your approach is. And so it's, like, coming from this perspective that I'm not here to study you, I'm here to be a part of the community, and what ways can I also be humble and contribute to this community, so that way you're not coming from this outside perspective. And you see this even in, like, with my study, like, at Dartmouth, like, the Native students, like, when Jim was coming to the Native American house, like,
everything just stops.
But as soon as he left, like, everyone was going back to joking. But it is, like, coming from these positions of, like, part of the institution. It's like, but really, like, trying to elicit those responses or that data from your community speakers. It's like, maybe even, like, removing yourself. Like, you can't be a part of that, and you have to be okay with those instances where it might seem frustrating at times, but being okay with that because you aren't coming from an outsider's perspective.
I think something really useful we can take from anthropology is this idea of reflexivity. And even though a lot of us are experimentalists and are striving toward minimizing certain kinds of influence, I think it's really important not to forget that interviews and experiments are not neutral in any way, right? They're not necessarily anything like what people do in other contexts, but they are social contexts. They have social elements that can be analyzed as part of the experiment, and I think that goes a long way toward mitigating any problematic aspect of having this really decontextualized sort of context to do our work.
Kind of like in relation to what Rachel just said and what I'll just said too, ideally the way to approach anything would be to have converging evidence from different methodologies, right? So I think in language research, at least, we kind of tend to have the methodologies tied to the researchers quite a bit. People identify very strongly as, as field workers or as experimentalists or as corpus linguists. Whereas ideally it would kind of be standard practice that your hypothesis needs to be supported by each of these methodologies before we feel really great about it. Or if there's a particular methodology in which the hypothesis is not supported, and you don't think you should revise the hypothesis, you should really be able to explain why this methodology isn't suitable for testing. But we kind of don't hold ourselves to that. And I guess if I submit a paper that it has an experiment in it, and the experiment took a really long time, and tenure's getting really close, I'm going to be upset if they send back the paper and say you didn't do a corpus investigation, and you didn't do an interview investigation, but
That's 4 other papers.
right. So we kind of feel okay saying like, well, those guys over there will do that, but maybe we shouldn't be doing that.
Or collaborate.
Yeah, well,
We should be
yeah.
collaborating a lot, as standard.
And I think especially across institutions, because there are some departments that have kind of a lab culture where collaboration happens constantly, and there are other departments where really people aren't collaborating. Especially, it seems like field workers are people who often don't have collaborators. Ethnographers typically don't have collaborators, but experimentalists often do have collaborators. And I think that's also important for diversifying linguistics, because the schools that have labs tend to be kind of the best resourced institutions, and so people who are coming from less prestigious university backgrounds are less likely to have access to that kind of collaborative effort.
So yeah, I guess in one way to encourage this again is to bring people together and really be talking to each other. Is there any way that, besides having conferences like this, that other suggestions for how to do that? Like, so how do we get more interaction between social linguists who work on prosody and people who work on prosody and don't know anything about social linguistics?
Craigslist.
They took down the personals. We can't.
There are kind of platforms for doing it. So like when a new statistical methodology kind of comes to the field, there's often some kind of special issue of something where people say like, look everybody, we really need to be doing this. Like the mixed effects modeling issue of general natural language over 10 years ago now, and that was kind of pretty influential. And after that, people felt like, gosh, we should really be doing this. I mean, maybe there needs to be kind of efforts like that where people are collectively standing up and saying, this is what we need to be doing in the field.
We might take semantics as a model. They have regular summer schools where they bring experts in particular aspects of semantics together and bring students in. There's fellowships that support this. And it would be a way of achieving the kind of collaboration, because you bring people from different institutions to teach there. They last long enough that you can actually start to talk about the practicalities of achieving a collaboration. If something like that could be achieved in this area, and it's the same does really well as they keep going from year after year. I don't know what their funding sources are, so that's probably the sticking point. But that model might actually work quite well in a case like this,
LSA Institutes might be one venue. When's the one that's here?
I don't recall.
There's going to be one here in 2020 something. Yeah. I don't know other things too, but that's something to think about. But yeah, the special issue, that actually is maybe something we should talk about, because we had been talking about that. Is this something people would be interested in doing? Like maybe with this kind of focus to try to, bring some of this knowledge and how did you put it, Jason? Like make people, I don't know, just to have a big movement or something. If this would be something that people would be interested in, then we should definitely do this. So, yeah, I don't know. Can we get like some applause if people are interested in it, or like?
Are you saying explicitly that we would mount a special issue of something that comes out of this specific conference, or are you saying we would put something down the road so that those of us who aren't necessarily using these methods now could then see how we can integrate these new ideas into our work and then have that be at a later point?
I think both.
Yeah.
Right? So other ETAPs, they had a special issue that where they encourage people from the conference to submit, especially on the theme, but they also welcomed outside contributions. And we were considering this, but we hadn't quite yet decided what to do. But it sounds like this might actually be a natural kind of topic or a goal of such an issue. So if that is something that people are interested in, then
we can put that call out on our mailing list and.
Yeah. And we would want to brainstorm with people with more social linguistics background on where would be a good venue for this, because that's a question and we're not quite sure.
So, do you mean a topic of like prosody and sociolinguistics?
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, I think on the sociolinguistics side, we always have a huge need for more prosody. I don't know what
You
colleagues
always
would say. It seems like we always need more prosody in sociolinguistics. It's just a very segmental field and optical, so I think it'd be a positive thing.
Okay.
I think it would be positive on both sides. Yes, prosody needs more sociolinguistics. Okay. Right, I mean, that evidently. I mean, from what you're saying, evidently.
Yeah, okay, so this is great. So we're going to have a giant AAE prosody project and a prosody and in social linguistics and in prosody thing. I think we can do this though. I don't think it's just like, something, we should do this. It's something doable.
I was also thinking about conferences like Speech Prosody or ICPHS, right? It's also organized like panels there that get
this is
people
something
together. So it's
yes.
normally there's very little about social linguistics, and it's so important, right?
So do people, social linguists, go to places like, what are they? Speech Prosody. What are the other ones?
Speech Prosody or ICPHS. ICPHS more, right? Less speech prosody, not many.
Yeah. He wasn't so yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this is very exciting. Are there other things, lovely suggestions people want to bring here? If not, I'd like to say bring a little bit, talking more about the F0 stuff that came up. But not if there's some other things that people want to discuss first. Okay, let's move on to that then. So this is something that came up because of the focus on CREAK F0 today. So I just want to talk a little bit about this voice source characteristics. So one of my favorite quotes about F0 and F0 measurements from this really ancient, well, somewhat ancient, a paper from 1990 of PIERREHUMBERT. So in this paper, PIERREHUMBERT talks a bit about F0, and so you think of this as regularly occurring points of glottal closure, but what happens when, well, it's supposed to be periodic, right? So you measure cycle to cycle, or, have something like that in mind when you have an algorithm, but then you have rapid transitions, so you have like a tone 4 Mandarin, woo, and it's like, if I work with things like, oh, the F0 went away, there's no F0, like, no, that's just because it was, really fast, or as we've seen amply, breathy, glottalized voice quality, other kinds of voice qualities can certainly whatever you want to say, interfere with an idealized smooth F0 contour segmental interactions. One thing I like PIERREHUMBERT says is, that, well, these kinds of examples cast in the doubt our sense that this kind of idealized F0 contour is a well-defined level of phonetic representation, but rather appears to be a rough and handy seat of the pants type of affair. And I think that that's something to keep a little bit in mind. F0 certainly, of different kinds of voice source properties, easy to measure in the sense that we have the tools readily available in PRAAT, like, PRAAT doesn't have a blue line that shows, H1 minus H2, blah, 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 blah. So, just people are used to thinking about F0, but, there's stuff going on beyond. One thing, of course, is there's regular, there's always updated work on F0 estimation itself. One thing that's come up that's not super new, but is relatively new, I thought I'd point out is one that's called Reaper. One reason I want to put this out is because David Talkin, who developed the SNAC ESPS Get F0 Wrapped, it has like 6 different names, but it's all the same thing. It's been getting hard to use because it's like TCL/TK and stuff. But Reaper is on GitHub. There's also a Python wrapper. Some of you may know about the there's Australian accent people in here, the voice source with the original Yen. It was Australian, so he thought it was funny. That's why it's called voice source. But anyway, there are these tools out there that we can also share about. One thing that came up was the cane and other things. So there's a recent JASA Express letter from Tianjin Huang, and this mentioned that, yeah, they use that same cane algorithm that I believe you mentioned, in conjunction with this other, I think this is one, might be a vocal fry. I forgot if it's specific to vocal fry, but from Ishii et al. One thing you'll notice is, see, I have all these links to GitHub repositories here. So something that's very useful is when people put up these tools and make them readily available and have documentation so we can use them. But anyway, I just thought I'd point out that there are these resources available. But yeah, with F0 estimation and PRAAT, I also don't have my cursor, but you can see that circle there. That's something I think maybe many of us have seen. But I'll bet you I could change those settings up there in advanced pitch setting and get that to change. So one thing I'll just point out is that something that can be helpful is when people also report settings and things, because the F0 estimation algorithms we have, I don't think there's a single one that doesn't have various heuristic methods we have to put in for, for trying to smooth it out or whatever. And so, even if people say we set it as defaults or something, that can be helpful. So another thing I want to point out that came up, and I'm talking really too much, so please also interject. But about the CREAK and different kinds of CREAK, this is something that's been an issue for a while. 2001 here, this paper is a little more recent than 1990, but still, a while now. And they had this lovely table for different ways that people have referred to kinds of CREAK, whatever that means. It might be too small for you to read, which is kind of the point. But I want to draw attention, and it's kind of a mess, but it's something that's being worked on. But the fact is, when people talk about CREAK, it's not quite clear what they mean. And this is something that also comes up in our studies, thinking about getting a little bit more detailed about what that means, and that may also impact what kinds of results we end up with. So I wanted to really briefly bring up one kind, and then obviously open up. So there's one that shows up under different names, but some people call it something like period doubling or diplophonia or something like that. And something you can see here is that people are saying there might be multiple F0s going at once. So there's two things going on. One, which is that CREAK, depending on what kind of CREAK you're talking about, isn't necessarily always contingent on low F0. Vocal fry, in the way that people generally define it, is. So vocal fry is contingent on a low F0 widely spaced glottal pulses, but not every kind of creak is, and there also may not be like a single F0. So I thought we could get a live demo from Pat Mitchell. I don't know what they call these people, but a diplophonator. So this person's name is a colleague of mine, John Kingston's, and he promised he'd come up and demonstrate.
My vocal folds are a bit dry right now. I'll do my best.
You were supposed to be prepared. So, diplophonia.
So Steve thinks that I creak too much, and that
I can say you creak too much.
and that I might be able to talk after another couple of decades of this. So, all right. So apparently I can do this sometimes at different pitches. So, it's something to see how well I can do.
Yeah, so thank you, John, and other couple examples I have. Oh, did someone want to comment on that?
There's lots and lots of recordings of that.
Online?
So here's some. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, what were you saying?
I was just confirming to Stephanie I would give her a copy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll put that up on the RSF repository too. So this is just very quickly. This is some Cantonese data I collected, and there's sort of different kinds of creak you can see here, or here. So you can kind of see something going on here. Here's another example. I believe, yes, this is all the same speaker, even some of them the same places, tokens. This one, I don't know what people hear. You hear kind of like, there's one, and here's another one. And one thing I just wanted to show you, quick and dirty, that I like to do sometimes is if you do a narrowband spectrogram, so I can go to spectrum settings here, and I'll just, change this like maybe 0.05 and drop this to maybe 1,500 or something. Then you can see here these harmonics encroaching here, versus if I do the same thing here. What did I do? 1,200 or something? 1,500. Thank you. Harmonic structure here is destroyed, but that's different from what's going on there. And then I think this one, there can also be a mix of that kind of thing. Let's see. So same thing here. This is kind of a little bit of, so also some, this is, yeah, a little bit of a mix. You can see some of that subharmonic structure there, also destroyed there. So I just kind of want to show that really quick, because I know it's something that came up, and then I want to shut up so other people than me can actually phone in. But yeah, so this is something that does come up, so that one issue is if you want to call all these kinds of things creak, I don't know how important that is, but I do want to state the point out there are things other than kind of like vocal fry low zero contingent creak, and then I'll shut up now so other people can talk.
What would you call the two that you just identified there?
This one, there's different things, but I think, so the one where the harmonic structure is really just completely destroyed. Again, it's not always just going to be an all or nothing. There can be a mix of these things, but you can see also
Look at the very beginning, Christy. There's a little, yeah.
Here.
Yeah, you see it in the spectrograph? You can see a little extra in between points there. Or harmonic, sorry.
Here. There.
Just at the beginning of the one.
This one. Yes?
Yes.
Stephanie's getting at the point of the screen.
Oh. Yeah.
That actually was at the beginning of the following round, too.
Yeah. A little bit. So, you know, I have in the past tried to say like, oh, this is pure dog, this is vocal fry, but you know, there is a mix, can definitely be a mixture, but you know, there are clear things where you know, this is a kind of qualitatively different behavior. This one, you know, if you go in and look at the waveform, you might be able to detect, oh, there's maybe two ways I could see possible repeating cycles. And, you know, there's, I think Isher and a collaborator did some kind of ratio and tried to see how that perceived, like, affected people, streaming sun, I think. And that's some harmonics ratio or something. But anyway, yeah, I would probably call this something like pure doubling or dipophonia, but given all the terminology, I think that's something that's as important when people say, oh, I'm calling this blah, 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 to say what they mean. Like, look, this is what I'm calling blah, blah, blah. Or, you know, this blah, blah. The pure doubling. So, anyway, again, I'm not supposed to talk anymore, so other people want to talk, so.
Can you go back to slide 16?
Slide 16.
I think it's 16.
16.
We were showing the paper from Journal of
Yes.
But one more, sorry, 15.
Oh.
So when you showed us this, I noticed at the bottom that it says Bureau of Glottal Affairs. Right. And then you give us this long list. So when I saw that, I was kind of primed for a long list. Right? So when we're talking about this in linguistics, we used to just say CREAK. So we used to just belonging everything in one category. But for people who are needing to look at more fine-grained distinctions, because they're at the Bureau of Glottal Affairs, I think
That's a joke. That's the department of whatever head and otolaryngectomy something.
Right, but it's also School of Medicine, right? So
yeah, but they work regularly with linguists, but
exactly. So what I'm saying is that we have this long list because they have a need to make these fine-grained categories, and this is kind of what you were saying in terms of. But I'm not advocating necessarily spending all our working with a school of medicine on this, but we're learning from another discipline that what we call one category might not be one thing because there are several different divisions that we might make depending on what's happening and what you just said in terms of like it's not just F0 that affects this. It can be all other kinds of things. And because we're not used to looking at those other kinds of things, then it affects how we do our analysis, if that makes sense.
yeah, one quick thing I want to say is Jody Kryman, who I've talked about this, I don't know if there's an actual study on this, but she's told me anecdotally she feels females use more, period doubling, which could make sense. Like if someone whoever has a natural pitch range that's higher, it's going to be hard to get down to some, 7 to 78 or whatever hertz you need for vocal fry. So I think it'd be really cool if people who are studying interactions with gender might actually see if this is true or if there's data on this. So it seems like there could be some interesting interaction with gender.
And I think we need some perception work on this, right? Because we might know, okay, there are differences acoustically, but do people actually attend to those differences? How many types of CREAK do people actually hear? Do they have different kinds of social associations? Maybe they can hear differences, but they still, socially think of them all as kind of meaning the same thing. And as far as I know, we don't know anything about that, really.
How fine-grained is the automatic CREAK detector that you're using, Ra? Like, is it just a yes or no CREAK?
It's a binary classification.
So there's no way to tweak it and add it?
No, but I mean, so Keating, Gorelick, and Kryman have at the last ICPHS, actually, they did a nice paper where they cataloged 6 different types of CREAK, and for each of them they talk about the different acoustic correlates of each of them. So there are ways to use acoustic methods to try to disentangle the different.
But it's tricky because, like, also for those kinds of things, like from the Bureau of Glottal Affairs, sorry, they have this great thing for synthesis, but it's mostly based on and the waveforms, the clean waveforms, they'll interact with vowels, because if you're looking at a waveform, and like, in this case, I happen to be working with diphthong, how, then it can be very tricky to use a waveform because the modulations of the waveform will also be due to things going on with vowel quality. So it's tricky, but I think that is definitely an area that is being developed.
I could just add, were you referencing the Matter group?
I don't know.
Okay, there was a group in Germany that developed a, I think, 6 characteristic, 2, 3, or 4 levels per characterization system for irregular pitch periods. And they tried to apply it to running speech. And they found themselves in 2 or 3 hour discussions on single tokens. And we haven't heard too much about this system since. If I'm remembering the private paper correctly, I think their point was this big table shows how bad things are in our understanding. And their idea, I think, is that you shouldn't try to characterize. What you should try to do is synthesize. So they have a gadget with controllers on it. And you, the clinician, listen to your patient, and then you play with the gadget until you reproduce the sound that you hear. And that's the characterization, if I'm remembering.
No, that's the thing, which.
That's a whole other ballgame then, right?
No, it's a start, but I'm saying like we have to be careful. Like it can be difficult to use the waveform because of if we're looking at things other than like a steady state like now. Yeah, but you.
This is to Lon's point. I wish Connie was still here, but he's looked at the realization of model stops in various languages of Mexico, and he gets a realization which consists of as minimal as just a little dip in amplitude is sufficient to convey that the model stop is present between 2 vowels, all the way to full-blown silence, cutting off the first vowel for a period of time and beginning the second one. And so it kind of addresses the question of, what's the function of this element in the stream of speech, and a huge variety of different ways in which that element with the same function can be utilized. So it's not really addressing sort of whether you perceive these things the same way as whether they actually serve the same purposes for that speech community. So I think we need to sort of keep that in mind as well as whether particular allophones, if you like, are perceived as different or as same.
We have a few more minutes, so please, if anyone has anything else they want to bring up in the context of this roundtable, please do. Students first. And I guess open floor. All right, well, if that's the case, then I just had a couple more announcements. So one thing I think maybe you saw from this brief roundtable was how helpful it can be for talking to people and sharing things when we share stuff. So we really appreciate if people can please try to put up your talk and slide materials at the OSF repository. And as you know, you are being live streamed, and we will also have conference videos up post-conference for people who have given us permission to do that. So please do fill out the release form if you're willing to have that done. And remember, if you haven't already, that you can get all this from the website here. So upload the OSF and then signing the release form. Another note is we're trying to be eco-friendly and try to reuse the name tag, lanyards, and plastic things. So you're welcome to keep your name and the pronoun ribbons and everything. But if you wouldn't mind, if you can get the plastic things and lanyards back in the basket that's on the food tables, or if you have extra dining hall cards, that'd be great. And so yeah, we'll be in touch about this exciting special issue coming up. This would be really, really great. So we'll be in touch about that. But also, I have the pleasure of announcing that the next ETAP will be happening, and it is at well, not drum roll, but it was there was a place.
God willing, it'll be at Princeton.
So is there anything else we need to say?
Also, it's going to be co-organized. It's not just me. Because I don't have grants.
Oh, who are you?
Yes, physically after.
Oh, you're pointing to Jason Bishop?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. And let's give a big hand to our AV team here. Thank you so much. And I guess that's it. Thank you very much, everyone.